Thank you so much for joining us for this inspiring talk with Sharone Kornman. She recently incorporated the Connecticut nonprofit organization Voices of Hope, dedicated to preserving and sharing stories of Holocaust survivors for future generations in order to ensure historical accuracy about the evils of prejudice and intolerance and to fight present injustice. So without further ado, Sharone Kornman.
Hi. So I'm honored to be here today. Before I even get started, I just want to reduce the credit for incorporating Voices of Hope. Voices of Hope is a phenomenal organization that's been going on for about 15 years. I helped legally incorporate it about 7 years ago, and I am on the board and executive committee, but I don't want anybody thinking that I independently did something that great. But also I encourage people to go on the website and find out about the programming that we do. It's some really good stuff. And if anybody's associated with another organization and wants a speaker, including even a survivor, that's the place to go. Okay. So, as I was introduced, my name is Sharone Kornman, and I'm a daughter of 2 Holocaust survivors from Poland. That region of Poland, it was Poland and now it's part of Ukraine. And I wanted to speak to this group because usually survivors and children of survivors speak to groups that are predominantly Jewish, who many of those people already have heard a bunch of these stories, and I thought it's important to speak to people in a church, in particular because my mother was saved by a very religious Catholic woman, and it was her faith that largely drove what she did. And I think that's a message that I need to share with this group and talk about what could be done when something terrible is happening, and frankly, what wasn't done when something terrible is happening, so people can think about that moving forward. So let me set the stage for the story. Drohobych is, I would say Drohobych, which is my mother's hometown, is kind of comparable to West Hartford. I don't know how many people live in West Hartford, but there were about 50,000 people. It was about an hour and a half away from the nearest big city by car or train, although very few people had cars then. And there was a thriving economy within the town. On a warm summer day in 1925, Sarah Beanstalk, my grandmother, is walking her baby to a park, and a girl approaches as they get near the park and asks if she can play with the baby at the park, just like what could happen in this town. And Sarah says sure, and she gets to the park. Sarah sits on a bench, and this girl, this teenager, is playing with the baby very nicely, making faces at him, pushing him on a swing. And Sarah asks, "What's your name?" And the girl says, "Franya." And Sarah says, "Where are you from?" And Franya names a nearby village, a very poor village. And she says, "And what are you doing here today?" And Franya says, "I'm looking for a job. I have 5 younger brothers and sisters, and we all have to work to support the family. So I came here to find a job." So Sarah says, "You know what? You have a job. If you want to come and work for me, you'll take care of the baby. I'll give you a room, and I'll feed you, and you can go home on Sunday to your family." And just like that, and by the way, I didn't mention, and Franya was 15 years old. And just like that, Franya becomes part of the Beanstalk family. And everything is very nice. And then 2.5 years later, child number 2 is born, Pola. And at this point, Franya is, completely in charge of the children. The household is grown. There's more people that work. There's a cook and a cleaning person. But Franya takes care of the children. And then in 1931, my mother is born. That's the last child, Irene. And, it's a full house. At this point, they have moved. My grandfather, Israel Beanstalk, has built a house, a very large house that I was fortunate to see in the summer of 2019, and also a few years before that. It's a very big house. There's now multiple apartments. So the house is big. There's a big household staff, and Franya is completely raising these children. My mother would say, that Franya was very, very religious and went to church every Sunday, although she was illiterate. She'd never had a chance to go to school, but she instilled a lot of values in the children. Although the family was Jewish, Franya really instilled a sense of right and wrong based on her following, her religion. No, so everything is great. I mean, the family is doing wonderfully, and Israel's business in town is thriving. And I also had wanted to mention that the demographics, the town is basically 1/3 Jews, 1/3 Poles who are Catholic, and 1/3 Ukrainians. So and people interact to some degree, but they don't intermarry. It's limited socializing, but maybe in a business way they interact. And Israel had a lot of friends who were Poles and Ukrainians because of his business connections, and also he liked to go fishing. So he would go fishing with other people, and so that was his connection. So in September of 1939, everything changes. And I'm not a historian, so if people here are historians, you can correct me afterwards on some dates. But in September 1939, Germany invades Poland, and Israel goes off to fight in the Polish army, and the war is very quick, and Germany occupies Poland, and then also has made a pact with Russia that part of Poland becomes Germany and part of Poland becomes Russia, and this part becomes Russia. During that brief war, the oldest boy, Lushik, gets pneumonia, and because there's no medical care, he dies. So by the time Israel comes back from the war, his son is dead. I think Lushik was 14 years old at the time. And it's devastating. My mom would say her parents never really recovered. Her mother turned gray pretty much overnight, and the entire war was not as devastating as the loss of her son. So what happened in September 1939 when the Russians came is that because Israel was a successful businessman, he was kind of an enemy of the Soviets. So they basically booted him out of his house and took away his business and the family, and gave him a passport that labeled him as undesirable. Not because he was Jewish, but because he was a businessman. So the family moved to a nearby town and moved in with some relatives, and the two girls went to a Russian school. And things were bad, but they were somehow tolerable. In June of 1941, the Germans broke that treaty that pact with Russia and came back to the town and took it back. And ironically, my grandfather was really relieved. And he was relieved that the Germans were back because he knew he spoke German, he had traveled to Germany before the war. Germans were civilized people, and he was glad the Russians were leaving. Little did he know how terribly wrong he was. The family moved back into their house only to have everything kind of change overnight. The Germans decided that they didn't need that house, so they didn't take the house right away. They started to take things by sort of drips and drops. So first they took away his business. Then they started to make rules like, all the Jews have to, you've seen this, the Jews have to make and sew a star on their coats. The Jews can't go out, they have a curfew. Jews have an 8 o'clock curfew. And like almost on a weekly basis, there's a new rule about what Jews can and can't do. And by the way, the Germans also tell all the local people, and by local people I mean the people who are not Jewish, have at it, do whatever you want. There's a few days of violence. People are encouraged to go, take what you want, do what you want. It's a free-for-all. Nobody's protecting the Jews. People that had been family friends are coming into the house and taking things. People who had eaten at that table, these are your good neighbors, that had eaten at that table are now coming and taking and demanding china that they've eaten on. Crazy, it's a crazy world that's completely, if you think about who lives next door to you, imagine that person coming in and demanding your fur coat. I mean, crazy, crazy things. And then things will just get worse. And by the way, throughout this time, the family is in touch with Franja, but during the Russian occupation. But when the Germans come, one of the rules that they make is non-Jews cannot work for Jews. So that's basically the end. Franja can't work for the family. She still visits, but she has to get a different job. So during that time, first they start making all the rules. Jews can't go to school. Jews can't ride a bicycle. Jews can't ride a bus. They take away your car. There's all kinds of things, crazy. Like, you know, one week it could be you have to bring all of your skis. I mean, whatever it is, whatever rule they want, it's a free-for-all. So eventually, all the Jews in town, including my mother's family, then there's these things called actions, by the way, which is periodically, maybe every few weeks, there's an action which is a lot of violence. And a lot of Jews are rounded up, and sometimes they are, this is before they were being deported to camps. Sometimes a bunch of Jews are rounded up and taken to a forest where they're shot. And my mother knew, for example, about one of these because a cousin of hers who had hand knitted a pair of mittens, one day the mittens appeared in town and the girl did not. So they knew that the girl was no more, a 10-year-old girl. So eventually, all the Jews that are left are rounded up and put in a ghetto, which is just any random section of town that was probably designed to house, let's say, 1,000 people, now has maybe 8,000 people. It's just very, very compressed. It's not a special neighborhood. It's just a limited space. And you would have now my mother's family is sharing what you would call a one-family apartment with 4 other families. Paula, who is about 14 now, Paula can work because she looks older than she is, and Israel goes to work, but my mother still looks like a little girl, and she can't work, and Sarah who is only in her 40s, has become an old woman because of the death of her son. So there's a real fear that my mother and Sarah are not going to, they keep making these selections and they keep coming and taking the weaker Jews. There's this real fear that they're not going to survive. So, and all this time, they're in touch with Franya, who has now a job somewhere, but very limited access, and even visiting the ghetto is dangerous for her. And I should also say, the punishment for anybody who helps to save a Jew is very clear. If you're caught, you and the Jews that you have helped are going to be hanged in the town square or shot in the town square, and then they'll actually leave the bodies hanging. Like, it's a message, this is what will happen if you do this. So it's a very scary thing. At one point, there's an action, and Israel reaches out to one of his old fishing buddies, who has now been appointed the mayor of the town, Joseph Kostemsky. And the Nazis installed him as a mayor. He was not elected. He's used to be a Ukrainian judge. And he implores the mayor to save his family. There's an upcoming action, and his family's not going to survive it. And the mayor does not want to help because he has a wife and a teenage daughter. And my mother would describe it that her father, who was a very proud man, got on his knees and begged. And then finally, Mrs. Kostemsky says, "You have to save them." So at night, he had them come to the clock tower above City Hall. And the family of 4 hid in the clock tower for almost a week. And one employee in City Hall would bring them some pastries from and water from the bakery in City Hall. I'm going to pause and tell you that, because I'm going to forget to go back to that. When the war ended and the Russians liberated the town, they viewed Mayor Kostemsky as a Nazi collaborator. And they shot him, his wife, and his teenage daughter on the spot. No trial, no nothing. And nobody knew about this story. The only people that knew would be my mother's family. So when we went a few years ago with my mother, we went to City Hall and we said we would like to have him recognized. And then a few years later, we got contacted, and then we went back in the summer of 2019. There is now a plaque at City Hall marking this location. But for us going back, nobody would even know about it. It's a kind of and maybe there's other stories like that. Anyway, they survived, but from their position in the clock tower, looking out the window, they could see everything going on it's the town center, like West Hartford Town Center. They could see everything. It's a big open square. They could see tremendous violence. These 2 girls could see everything, and they couldn't do anything about it. When things quieted down, they went back to the ghetto. And now we're approaching the winter of 1942. And the ghetto is being, the phrase that's used is liquidated, which means it's being the people are being killed, now there's deportations to camps, they're taken to the forest. There's all different ways with the goal of just, the goal in the Holocaust was to eliminate the Jews, to make every place in Europe, and probably eventually the world, Juden-free, no Jews. So, they're now killing, deporting, doing whatever to get rid of the Jews. So as we're approaching winter, Franja comes to the ghetto and says, give me the children. She realized there's no hope for anybody. There's no hope that this family is going to survive. And so she comes on Christmas Eve, particularly because on Christmas Eve, that's when they know that the guards outside the ghetto are going to be celebrating, which means they're going to be drunk. And she comes there and my mother at this point is 11. She wrapped, and everybody's emaciated. There's not enough food. She does not look like a normal 11-year-old would look. And so she wraps up all of her clothing on her, to bulk her up, and covers her hair, which is very dark, and takes her hand, and they walk out of the ghetto. And as soon as they're in the street, there's carolers everywhere, and they join a group of carolers, and they're singing Christmas songs. My mother doesn't know them, but she's singing whatever, and they walk out like that, and nobody even notices. And they go to Franja's apartment, which I didn't see the inside of it, but I've seen a diagram by my aunt, and I've stood outside of the apartment. The apartment Franja's apartment was, her window was probably 50 feet away from a large building that was a Gestapo headquarters. So very close. And at this point, Franja has a job working for the Gestapo. This is what you can do during the war. So she brings Irene home at night, and this is the deal. My mom is 11, and when Franja works a 12-hour shift, and during the day, my mother can't move because Franja lives on the third floor, and there's somebody below her. So if anybody below her hears footsteps, they're going to know that there's somebody in that apartment. So my mother all day long is under a bed, hiding. And then at night, and there's also, Franja is illiterate, so there's nothing to read. There's nothing to do. There should just be there, under there. And then Franja comes home at night, and Franja can't even bring home extra food because people will know there's only one person there. If it looks like more food is coming in, everybody is on guard. And I should also say that the reward, if you turn in a Jew, there's a financial reward. It's nothing impressive. I don't want you to think that people were getting rich off of this. The reward for turning a Jew in is the equivalent money to buy a loaf of bread. So this is what people were doing. People were turning in other people for a loaf of bread. And the people that turned in, they knew exactly what was going to happen when they turned them in because they could see it, because it was very, some of us have heard people say, I didn't know what was happening. You knew because it was happening in the town center. For people that say they didn't know, I don't know how you couldn't know. Anyway. Your neighbors were disappearing, and you were living in their houses. People moved into the houses. People were wearing their clothing. You had to know that these people, something happened to them, and it wasn't good. This is going on for about 4 months. My mother is by herself, and not thriving mentally. At one point, my mother, Nickelodeon did a little special, which is available on my mom's website, where they interviewed some survivors and their grandchildren. My oldest son was 11 at the time, and they asked him, how would you feel? You're the same age. How would you feel? What do you think? How do you think your mother felt? Your grandmother felt? And like a typical 11-year-old, my son said, I would be bored, because our children, if you don't entertain them all the time, they're bored. And my mother said, I felt a lot of things. I was hungry, I was afraid, I was sad. One thing I never was bored. So it's funny how, it's the same age, but that's, the way it was. Anyway, after about 4 months, Franja could see that this wasn't going to work out. So she went back, and first she got Sarah, and then she got Paula. How she got these people out, I don't know. My mother couldn't even tell you. It's a kind of a miracle, but somehow, even though Franja was illiterate, she was very smart. And there's a lot of little side stories about things, little close calls. Like, here's an example. Well, she got these 2 other people, and the 3 of them then hid like that. 2 girls under a bed, Sarah in a closet, all day long, no movement, no talking. One little example of some story where you can see how innately brilliant Franja was. somebody in her building suspected her. This is a small building. The neighbor's door is maybe 20 feet away. She had like a little, we would call it a studio. She knew somebody was suspicious. So one day, and these 3 people hiding there, Franja opens the door, all the doors and windows, and announces, it's spring cleaning. You know, in the middle of the war, spring cleaning. And she does, the window, everything is open for hours for the sole purpose of dispelling any suspicion that there's anybody hiding, because you would never do that. If another funny little story like that was, at one point, the nearby Gestapo wanted to occupy that building and even kick out Franja. So when one of the Germans was coming to inspect, she threw a bucket of water against the wall. So when he came in, the outer wall was all wet. Like it was dripping with water, and he said, "What is this?" And she says, "I don't know. I guess when it rains, the water leaks." So again, it's just so then they didn't want the building. These are just little examples of, you know, you can't make this up and you can't read it anywhere. She just knew. It was like survival instincts. Israel, she couldn't hide Israel because he had been a very heavy smoker pre-war, and he had a cough, and there was he was also 6 feet tall, but he also had a very a loud cough, and he couldn't hide there. So Israel himself, he got out of the ghetto and he went to the woods, and he had his own stories, but he was eventually captured, and he survived 5 camps. And that's another story, but not for today. The war ends, and in spring of 45, and the Russians liberate the town, and I told you what happened to Mayor Kostemsky. And you know, this area is now going back to Russia. And so the Jews, and there's very few, they come out of their hiding places almost like bugs. You know, nobody knew that the ghetto is empty. Nobody knew that there was any Jews. Very few people left. I mean, you can go on the internet. I don't even think 300 people survived. The fact that any of them survived is a miracle. And they were permitted to go to a nearby town that was still Poland, and that's where they went. And they, as you can, and they took Franja with them. Franja is, you know, now in her late 20s, and she went with them, and they got, you know, Sarah started to do some trading on the black market, and to make a living there, you know, and somehow miraculously Israel survived several camps, and he tracked them down by asking different people. There's no internet, no real access to phones or anything, but asking people. He found out where they were, and he met up with them, and the families reunited. He was, you know, he was able to start a business again, and eventually the family is up and running. The girls are tutored, and then they return to high school, although I will tell you, they're going to school with almost no Jews. And if you can imagine what it's like to go to school with people whose families did various nefarious things during the war. And not only that, but many of these kids and the teachers looked at these Jews with this sort of open disdain, like, why are you still here? You're supposed to be dead. These were people that collaborated, so they're not looking for these Jews. It was very hard and very oppressive. And eventually the family was permitted to go to Israel, newly formed Israel. And they went, and they very sadly they wanted Franja to come with them, but she wouldn't. She said, I won't be. Actually, what she said is, I won't be able to go to church. I have my life here, I have my friends here, and I can go to church here. I can't learn another language. And so they parted very sadly. For the rest of their lives, for the rest of Franja's life, my mother and her sister would send packages and money to Poland. And as a child, and then eventually Franja came to visit in 1977. So I was 13 at the time, and at that moment, I didn't understand the full impact of any of this. I just knew, okay, this woman had saved my mother. I had only met one grandparent, my grandfather, who lived in Germany after the war, and then would come once a year. We didn't speak any common language, so I didn't have any. I can't say I had a strong connection. This woman came, an older woman. She cooked a lot of pierogi, but I was a child. I didn't have any real patience or interest for this story. I was living my own life. But she came for 6 weeks, and then to our house, and then 6 weeks to to Paula and her family's house in Atlanta. And then they couldn't convince her to stay here. And very sadly, she went back to Poland, and she passed away from cancer a year later. But all my childhood, my mother and Paula, twice a year, they would send packages to Poland. And I did not understand any of this, but my mother would take all of our clothing that we had outgrown that was in very good shape and package it up. She would go to a very nice grocery store and buy really beautiful, like expensive cookies and coffee, and she would box it up and send it to Poland. I knew this was happening twice a year, and I never understood. And all I could think of was, who's wearing my clothing? You know, what do you think? How do you know that my clothing is going to fit somebody? And also, why are we sending coffee overseas? It's not cheap. Why are we, don't they have coffee? When we visited with my mother a few years ago and met Franya's niece, I learned that what was really going on is, which you all probably know, she was selling it all on the black market. This was when Poland was under, was part of Russia, and there was no money, there was no, there was no coffee. So what was being sent there was actually not Poland was part of Russia, but where she was living at the time was part of the Soviet Union. This stuff was it was better than money. Actually, if you sent money, that would be confiscated. But this stuff somehow, and Genya, who's Franya's niece, said that one year they replaced the roof on one of the buildings using some of these things. So I didn't know that this was a commodity. I thought it was just how you would send somebody, food, whatever. So, that's really the end of the story. But I want to share, I don't know how long I've been talking. I hope I covered everything. I think I did. I want to share what this is. So this is Yad Vashem is a museum in Israel, and it's the first Holocaust museum, and they created an honor, which is called Righteous Gentile. And it's very hard it's a very high bar. There is my friend this is Debbie Kamaides. She's also a daughter of a Holocaust survivor. He's still alive in town. And it's a very high bar, and as she pointed out today, it's a closed process. And sometimes you don't know exactly, why someone gets designated and doesn't. But there's an application, and some of the criteria, which are on my phone, but I'm not going to read. Some of the criteria are, basically, you had to be a non-Jewish person. You had to save a Jew from death during the Holocaust with no expectation of reward. Because some people hid people because they were being paid. Some people hid people because they were promised something afterwards. Or maybe they were told, a lot of people gave up their children, and said, take my child. If you had the expectation of being paid now or later, or that you would adopt a child, or that you would convert, some very well-meaning people took children with the intention to convert them. If any of those are true, then you can't qualify. It has to be somebody who risked their life with zero expectation of any compensation. And Franya has received this, and this is I have it now. Franya received it after she had passed away. Paula and Irene, completed all the paperwork and did this, and it also includes, if the person is alive, immediate citizenship to Israel without any waiting process. The most famous person that has this is Oskar Schindler, and which, if you've seen the movie or heard of the movie Schindler's List, he's the most famous person. But there are I looked it up this morning, there's about just under 28,000 people from various countries who have this designation, and it's not awarded to Jewish people. It's specifically, if a Jewish person was in a position to save, there's no reward because there's an expectation that they would do that. So this is strictly Righteous Gentile. This is strictly awarded. And when I think about this, it's very meaningful that Franya received this, and she really was a person that did this without any expectation, and really because she loved the children, but also she was really driven by her deep religion and her deep faith that this is what you're supposed to do. And when I think about the message I want to convey is that, look, candidly, very few people in this room, probably including me, would do what she did. That to put yourself at risk and put your family at risk of certain death is not something that some people have it in them, but it's not something that we have to aspire to. But there's a lot of other things that can be done. When some people, a tiny fraction did what she did. A lot of people stood by and did nothing. They knew what was happening. School friends. One of the stories I remember my mother told me is that one day one of Paula's friends came and said, there were some beautiful plants. You're not going to survive anyway. So some people did kind of nothing. Some people did those sort of innocuous things. Give me your plants. You're not going to survive. And some people, for a loaf of bread, did a lot worse. Actually, turn people in. And when you think, so my charge is, look, I go to synagogue every week. I guess all of you go to church on a regular basis. If you're doing this, there's a reason you're doing this. You have some belief that you have some obligation to your fellow man. So we all have an obligation to do something. You don't have to do all of that, but there's always something to do. And that's my message on behalf of my mother, is do something. And that's it. I guess I... Questions? I may have left some gaps here. If anybody has any questions, I could answer them on here, or you can approach me. Also, if you're interested, years ago my brother set up a website. It's if you Google the name Irene Frisch, Frisch, that was my mother's married name, you'll find my brother very nicely created a Wikipedia page for her, and she wrote many stories, including the one about Christmas Eve. She wrote a lot of stories, and they're all on that page. So just Google her name, you'll find a page. If you Google Irene Frisch Holocaust, you're going to find that. And there's a little clip of that video, which my son is very embarrassed about, because he's 11. But it aired on Nickelodeon, Nick TV, whatever. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. So, okay.
Would you just spell the last name of your Frisch?
Sure. Mm-hmm. F like Frank, Risch. Okay,
thank you.
So. Yeah, and by the way, on a happy note, I don't know if you shared it with the congregation, but last Christmas, my mother passed away a year and a half ago. She made it to 90, and some of the people here can say we celebrated her birthday in synagogue. We bought ice cream, we have a meal like this afterwards. And my mother grabbed the microphone. She was not shy. She was not exactly, she was with a walker, but we never knew what she would say. It was always a little nerve-wracking. And my mother took the microphone. Debbie is her husband is the rabbi of our synagogue, Rabbi Small. And my mother said, today I'm 90. I'm not supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be dead. But I'm here and Hitler isn't. I win. And it was, right? So I'm trying to think of what name. Anyway, just in a sort of in a final kind of a satisfying moment. Last Christmas, they had the White House Christmas party, and my older son, the one that was on that Nickelodeon thing, through a friend of a friend and through no deserving act on his part, he got a ticket. He and his wife got a ticket to the White House Hanukkah party. And they were there, and it was kind of an incredible moment. But I wrote an article in the Current because it gave me pause to think of where he was and where my mother was almost, so let's see, like basically 80 years earlier, where my mother was on Christmas Eve, and then fast forward, and at the time when my mother was being rescued, or when she was in the ghetto, the United States and I won't add an adjective, my mother would, our blank president had zero interest in saving the Jews, not one, although he knew, he had no interest. And now, fast forward, my son is standing in the White House. It was quite a moment to think of where my mom was, purely for no reason at all. She was there. There was no good reason why she was there. I would say wrong place, wrong time. Fast forward 80 years, equally undeserving, my son is in the White House, right place, right time. And it was, in the span of a lifetime, unfortunately my mother did not live to see him, but I'm sure she was watching and having a good laugh. And, anyway, that's the, so, I don't know.